Get started, I want to start off by welcoming all of the colleagues that were able to join us today. Today is an important day as it marks an important moment as we gather to launch the Interagency Standing Committee's Climate Roadmap. Colleagues, as we confront the realities of climate change, it is clear that it is not just an environmental issue, but a profound humanitarian crisis. Each flood, drought, and storm we witness underscores the urgent need for a responsive and adaptable humanitarian system. Colleagues, our work, as we all know, is cut out for us. The latest findings from the if I may ask colleagues just to put their phones and computers on mute, I would greatly appreciate it because there's a lot of background noise. Thank you, colleagues. So the latest findings, again, colleagues, from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change highlights that nearly 3.6 billion people live in areas highly vulnerable to climate impacts, which emphasizes the immediacy and scale of action that is required from the international community, and even more so, more specific, of our humanitarian community as well. As the frequency and the intensity of these disasters rise, populations in highly vulnerable situations, specifically women, children, persons with disabilities, older individuals, and displaced persons face exacerbating challenges. And in our daily operations, we see the tangible impacts of climate change on disrupted lives, damaged infrastructure, and increasing humanitarian needs that challenge not only the capacity and the resilience of communities, first responders, and national organizations and authorities, but also our own current response capacity. So as we launch this roadmap today, we are not just responding to a crisis, we are preparing for the future. And it speaks to the urgency not just of individual action, but it speaks of the collective action of all of the IASC members, Interagency Standing Committee members, in partnership with key stakeholders to better prepare for, adapt, and respond to the evolving landscape of global emergencies brought about by climate change. With that, I really would like to take this opportunity to express a particular thanks to FAO, IFRC, and OCHA for their co-leadership of this critical area of work within the Interagency Standing Committee, and for all of the IASC member organizations and partners and the humanitarian coordinators and operational colleagues who have contributed significantly over the past months for the formulation of this important roadmap. And against this backdrop, I'm extremely pleased that we are joined today by a distinguished panel who will speak to us about how we can implement this important climate roadmap collectively. And we are joined today, and I'm glad, George, you were able to join us, as I know you're not feeling very well today. So George Conway is, of course, known to many of us. He is the Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General and Resident Humanitarian Coordinator in Somalia. Glad, George, that you could join us today. I'm also pleased that we are joined today by Caroline Holt, who is the Director of Climate and Crises at IFRC. And last but definitely not least, Rain Paulson, who is the Director of Emergencies and Resilience at FAO. Welcome, colleagues, to this launch event, and congratulations again to all of yourselves, your organizations, and your colleagues, as well as the IC members, for bringing us to this point around the roadmap for climate action for the IASC. So first, perhaps just to kick us off, I'd like to turn to Caroline. Again, Caroline, colleagues, is Director of Disasters, Climate and Crisis at the IFRC. And with that, Caroline, perhaps you can get us started by speaking to us about the measures. What are the measures being taken to address climate-related humanitarian needs? What gaps still exist? And how can we enhance our collective efforts to fill these gaps? Over to you, please, Caroline.
Well, thank you, Mervat, and thank you to everybody that's joined today. We're delighted to have been invited to speak on this really important topic, and also very happy to see the launch of this roadmap. It's critical. We're living in times where records are being broken on an annual basis in terms of climate. We're seeing prolonged droughts, we're seeing raging floods, we're seeing heat waves, often concurrently, often overlapping, putting increasing pressure and crisis on access to food, on our ability to access clean and safe water, and it's people that are ultimately suffering. It's now a well-known and acknowledged fact that the climate crisis is really a humanitarian crisis, but one that the humanitarian sector alone, of course, cannot shoulder. So in terms of the measures that are being taken, we know that humanitarian needs are on the rise, that budgets are shrinking. These are well-known facts. And we know that as a community, climate change is keeping up and overtaking our ability to respond. So we need to rely on such initiatives as this one today, but also other initiatives that are taking place. The Charter on Climate and Environment for humanitarian organisations, for instance, is another really important action that will complement, of course. All of these things should be complementary, and I really call upon all of us to work together to make sure that they are. But it's critical that this IASC roadmap forms part of this journey, and it's something that we prioritise both sector-wide and also organisationally. The gaps, there are a number. There are three specific ones that I like to focus on. The gap in community resilience and adaptation activities is one. The gap in financing and interventions reaching local level is the second. And then third, really, gaps in coordination and coherence amongst us all. The good news is that we see the ability to start to address that through action, and action for all three of those. Number one, action around resilience and preparation. Support to people to really augment and enhance their own resilience, to get ahead of the disasters through prevention, preparedness, and adaptation. Let's not wait for those humanitarian consequences to hit. The second one around finance is that local really needs to go first. The money should be arriving where it needs to go, not just where it can easily go. And that, I think, is a push and a challenge for all of us to make sure that we're prioritizing those communities who really sit on the front line of the impacts of the climate crisis. And the third one is an action which is collective and really about smart partnerships. None of us can afford to compete for those dwindling resources. We know that we're more effective when we work together, and this will demand the creativity of all of us. And it's possible as well, you know, at the IFRC, we're playing our part, and we're trying to play our part. At COP27, for instance, we launched the Global Climate Resilience Platform. It really sees a prioritization of that locally led climate action and looking at how we can support national societies across our network of 191 national societies to really bring that to scale. We're also providing technical support so that there's a level of quality, of course, and potential impact in what we do. We're working with national societies on our own climate action journey to make sure that national societies themselves are working with governmental institutions and national institutions to strengthen things such as risk assessments, to enable more effective implementation, and really, again, make sure that climate action is locally led, locally defined, and locally driven. And then on the third part, we're really investing in leadership, not only of national societies, but also working with national society leadership to influence and support government action, bridging that policy and practice and making sure that we're able to see some results for that investment. So I guess in short, we need to make sure that we're doing this together, that we are investing in these smart partnerships. And we've seen some of that as well. Early warnings for all, I think, is a perfect example. Again, let's make sure we don't lose the opportunity of what the early warnings for all can deliver and is possible to deliver. Let's not get bogged down in the bureaucracy of it, because it's a beautiful thing in principle and we really should be driving towards it. And I suppose, for all of us, let's make sure that we put the needs of the affected people first and foremost, and maybe allow our own organisations to sit a little bit further back in that chain of priority. Thank you, Merva.
Many thanks, Caroline, and thanks again for highlighting the specific role, of course, of IFRC with the Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, globally, to look at how we can reinforce communities' resilience and their leadership of, to prepare for and respond and mitigate the impact of the climate crisis, but also the critical role played in facilitating and augmenting and reinforcing national capacities and government capacities. So I think the message is clear. Don't wait for crisis to hit. So there's a lot to be done in terms of preparedness, early warning, contingency planning to avert and minimize the impact of the climate crisis. There's a lot to be done in terms of reinforcing local capacities, community resilience. So again, channel the funds where they're needed most at the front line. And again, the important point that you raised, Caroline, around partnerships and smart partnerships, of course, within the IASC family, but even more importantly as well with the IASC family, with critical actors beyond the IASC, especially climate actors, the private sector, IFIs, and others. Many thanks again, Caroline, for these introductory remarks. And with that, I'd like to turn to Rain. And Rain, colleagues, Paulson is the Director of Emergencies and Resilience at the Food and Agricultural Organization. And here, Rain, it would be great to learn more from you about the IASC climate roadmap in more specifics. Why was it developed? What are its main objectives? And what are the steps being taken and that are planned to take forward the critical recommendations that are laid out in this roadmap? Over to you, please, Rain.
Medved, thank you so much. And it's a real pleasure to be here today for the launch of this all-important climate crisis roadmap. And just as I get into the roadmap itself, just to say, I think Caroline has underlined in a really compelling manner just why these questions are so important for us, and our collective action around this topic is so important for us. And we understand obviously what's happening with climate crisis driving increase in humanitarian needs across the world. Obviously, that's also true in terms of hunger. And just to say, even in the last edition of the Global Report on Food Crisis, where we documented the 282 million people in acute food insecurity, for those that haven't seen that, you'll recall that one of the primary drivers that's highlighted behind those record-setting numbers is perhaps unsurprisingly the impact of weather extremes and the impact of the climate crisis, and indeed the interplay between climate and conflict and economic shocks. But that's I hope that that's obvious to all of us, but it's just to really underscore the imperative for the work we're doing collectively, and the imperative for this roadmap, which is really focused. It's focused on the system as a whole, but it's really focused in particular on the country level work, what we do together within the humanitarian country teams, and how we take that forward. Important for the humanitarian community and all of us within it to drive forward this work because of the disparity that exists between attention to climate issues generally and what's done in crisis settings around these key questions. And so the roadmap is part of our collective approach to try and address this. And I do think it's important to underscore that successful climate action, as I think all of the organizations on this call can testify to from their own experience, is possible even in situations of extreme fragility, conflict, and contexts where we see severe humanitarian needs. And we certainly have evidence of effective measures that are available to help us as we work to avert and to minimize and address losses and damage associated with climate change and extreme weather events, and indeed as we pivot into adaptation. So again, that's really to underscore, I think, some of the points that Caroline made around the compelling need for this work. And this is precisely why the IASC deputies commissioned a roadmap, requested that it be developed by the working group, the IASC Climate Crisis Working Group, as a key tool to help guide our collaborative action across barriers and to enable collective scale up of action. And I should say, so this is to guide collective efforts, and it's also obviously to help each one of our institutions and organizations within that to support the most vulnerable people adapt to climate change. So that's why the roadmap was requested. I should say the roadmap, as you would expect, is a further elaboration, builds on commitments that have been made by numerous agencies and partners, including commitments that have been made under the Climate and Environment Charter for humanitarian organizations that's already been referenced. The roadmap as it was developed, and I think and would expect that many of those on the call today have been connected with this process. The roadmap was born out of extensive consultations that were carried out through 2023, in particular at the country level, engaging with humanitarian country teams, importantly engaging also with the intercluster coordination groups, as well as wider memberships of networks, ICVA to mention one of them, and through the family of the Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies too. So just on the roadmap itself then, on the key elements, let me focus on 6 key priority areas. And the roadmap is really concentrating on then the areas for particular attention as we try and identify and take forward multifaceted solutions required to tackle the climate crisis. The first of these areas that's addressed in the roadmap is around the need and actions to step up specific elements of short-term humanitarian action that are of particular relevance in the context of the climate crisis. So here we're talking, colleagues, about preparedness work, the all-important work around anticipatory action, collective efforts to support early warning systems, and wrapped around all of that, efforts to integrate in a more meaningful and systematic way climate risk analysis into our work. That's one side of it. There's another piece and component around this which relates to climate proofing our humanitarian response infrastructure and location. So there's a key set of pieces of work around that. Secondly, I'd highlight that the roadmap emphasizes the importance of complementing longer-term action to support adaptation and resilience investments to help people withstand future climate shocks and better to withstand those shocks better and to reduce humanitarian need, and work across the HDPN nexus, the HDP nexus as we talk about. Thirdly, the roadmap highlights what we consider then to be collective responsibility as regards reducing our own impacts as we're implementing humanitarian operations. So actions to reduce environmental impacts, greenhouse gas emissions of the emergency and humanitarian work we're doing. Fourthly, I'd emphasize the topic of financing, which you see understandably also features prominently in the roadmap. It's another key priority for us. And here, I think it's important to underscore that we're not just talking about more money. This is also about the nature of financing that's available. So it's about attention to financing to fragile and crisis context, but it's about the right type of financing. And in summary, the right type of financing in this regard is financing that is multi-year, that's flexible, that draws on pre-arranged mechanisms and instruments, all of which will allow us to enable and support and implement a different type of set of responses to climate crisis. So again, funding is always important. The amount of funding is always important, but the nature of the financing, its flexibility, its multi-year emphasis, and particular focus on the anticipatory elements is key. Fifthly, the roadmap puts forward recommendations that focus on key work when it comes to advocacy and communications, collective evidence-based advocacy and communications, seeing all of this as indispensable in our efforts to mobilize action in support of communities at risk, and indeed to push for greater accountability on their behalf. And this really picks up on, Caroline, where you ended your call to all of us, right, on how we understand priorities and really centering all of this on the reality of those that are impacted by disasters and working back from that. So that's also the way in which we should frame and do our advocacy and communication work. The sixth area and the final area I just mentioned at this point is around active collaboration and dialogue across sectors being facilitated in the right way. And here too, when we say the right way, what we mean to a large extent is that localization simply has to be at the center of climate action. ensuring that the action is led by local actors, as we all know, those that are first to respond to crisis and shocks, first to respond to climate and environmental shocks, and certainly those that are most proximate to disaster-affected communities, best placed to support with the assessment of needs. Let me maybe, Medvad, just in the interest of time, say three quick things in terms of the way forward. It's imperative that we understand both how to take this forward where it matters and to ensure that the humanitarian community represented by the IASC and leveraging, using the IFI structures steps up to meet the challenge. And again, as I said at the beginning, this roadmap is really focused on a key part of our IASC family, which is the way in which we come together at the level of humanitarian country teams. Secondly, we have been engaging and speaking around the roadmap with humanitarian and resident coordinators, as you would expect, primary focus in crisis context, both to understand their feedback, their reactions in terms of gaps and opportunities, and how we can progress the use of the roadmap. As recently as last week, there were a set of consultations and meetings that took place with a number of country level leadership that included at that stage Honduras, Chad, Somalia, Afghanistan, the DRC, to name but a few. And finally, just to say that the resulting asks, those that emerge out of the ongoing discussions that we really need to have with country level leadership as we take this forward, those asks, we have to find a way to surface them and to support them in a meaningful way at the global level. We can do some of this, and we will do some of this through the working group at the IASC that I mentioned. We need to do that obviously together with donors and the high level advocacy that's required to ensure that we're working collectively to drive solutions, and indeed, as we've all mentioned so far, giving voice to communities on the front line of the crisis. Medvat, I'll stop there for now and hand back to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Rain. Super clear, and thanks for walking us through the 6 key priorities of the roadmap. And if you haven't, colleagues, had the chance to see it, it is on the IASC website and should shortly be in the chat box if it's not already there. I highlighted, of course, short-term action, long-term action, the financing element, evidence-based advocacy and communication, and finally, dialogue across sectors with a particular emphasis on supporting localization and local actors and community efforts. I think this is a really good opportunity, of course, to turn to George, because, of course, there's a lot of points that were made earlier with regards to the importance of this roadmap, not just as a framework to guide our work at the global level, but where the rubber hits the road is ultimately at the operational level. And it will be fantastic, George, to hear from you because, of course, as again, Rainy mentioned, there are good examples, including in Somalia, where we can speak about the critical work that can be done to address the impact of the climate crisis in fragile contexts. So we're all keen, of course, George, to hear from you. So again, George, colleagues, he is, as you all know by now, he is the UN's Deputy Special Representative of the SG and the UN Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator in Somalia. And here, George, again, it will be great to bring us to reality, perhaps, on the ground. How can the roadmap be useful in contexts similar to Somalia? It would be great if you can shed some light on the lessons from your efforts and the efforts being carried out in Somalia to address and mitigate the impact of the climate crisis. If there are any good practices, challenges that would help, our audience, and I'm sure there are country representatives, humanitarian coordinators online as well, that will also benefit greatly from your experience and perspective. Over to you, please, George.
Thank you very much, Mervat and Rain and Caroline, and grateful for the opportunity. And I do apologize, I'm a little bit under the weather today, so I'm coming off as a little bit hoarse. But I appreciate deeply the work of the IASC on this package of issues. I appreciate the degree to which it's built on, has looked across countries and experience, and has tried to consolidate a package of good practice to guide us all collectively into a very complicated future. I was going to say an uncertain future, but it's not uncertain. The path of the climate crisis is clear. We know that things get worse from here, and we know that the impacts that we're seeing right now, today on the ground, only get worse. And that's very much the case in Somalia. Um, and the priorities identified in the roadmap are not just relevant to Somalia. They're many of the things that we're already practicing, and at the same time, we stand to learn from experience across the system as a whole. Last year was probably the worst year on record in terms of the impact of climate-related disasters in the country. It started the year, Somalia started the year last year with the worst drought in over half a century, forcing almost 7 million people into acute levels of food insecurity, and risking a famine, and ended the year last year with the worst flooding in over a century. Um, so what we've seen in the past mapping of the impacts of climate-related crises over the past 40 years, the cycles of these crises are getting shorter and shorter, and the impact is getting, or the risks are getting higher and higher. So we know where this trajectory goes, and it's incumbent on all of us to work towards better solutions. And the IASC and humanitarian organizations have a key role to play in that context, but very much aiming at a better joined up response between humanitarian, development, peace, and other actors. Um, just to note, in Somalia, we have tried to get better ahead of the curve in terms of anticipatory action. We have invested quite a bit in the analytics around the climate crisis, understanding what the trajectories are, where things are likely to go, and how these cycles are going to operate both now and for the future. I do have to give a very strong credit to FAO in this respect, because it has, through the various analytical capacities that it has in place jointly with the government and benefiting the system as a whole, gotten us ahead of the curve of understanding likely climate trajectories and risks through the SWALIM, the Somalia Water Information and Land, the Somalia Water and Land Information Management System, which gets really good analytics around future trajectories in the near term. And that allowed us, for example, going into the flooding of last year, which were impacted, of course, by the El Nino phenomenon, to identify flood risks, to get anticipatory measures in place, to help the local authorities work on evacuation plans, high ground areas, to get infrastructure in place that would help to mitigate the impacts of the floods, and so on. So the very concrete impacts in terms of our response, and that was very much appreciated. At the same time, our work on anticipation, we need to take a longer view, and this is where the nexus comes in very importantly, because we're not just looking at risk for the next 6 months or 12 months. We have to be looking at the known trajectory for the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 30 years. Because these risks are aggregating, they're accumulating, and they're only going to get worse and worse from here. So the ability of the humanitarian system through the IASC to work in great coherence and aggregation, development, climate actors, peace actors, is going to be fundamental to our ability to keep ahead of the curve for now and for the future. We have been seeing some success locally in trying to shift from a very short-termist view, which has been characteristic of responses in Somalia for, frankly, decades, to dealing with things that are Somalia, one of the countries that is in the top tier of countries impacted by the climate crisis, but contributed very little to it, has suffered from, up till now, a complete absence of effective financing for climate adaptation. This is now changing. This enables us to better engage as humanitarians with the development community, with the adaptation community in order to put in place the types of at-scale solutions that can really start to bend the curve of future risk. And I support fully all the comments around localization and investment in local capacities to help to mitigate local risks and to invest in adaptation. But we have to be and I have to say the Somali Humanitarian Fund, the SHF, I think has the highest level of funding of local and national NGOs of any in the world at 70% at this stage right now. But we have to look at working from local to national and working from national policies and programs and frameworks through at-scale area-based initiatives that can deal with some of the structural, infrastructural, and other constraints that are impacting on this right down to the level of communities and households. And so working across those levels in a more coherent way is, from our perspective, very, very important. I perhaps will leave my comments there and happy to come back with any comments or questions. Over.
Thanks a million, George. And again, it's reassuring and it's also encouraging to hear about the work taking place in Somalia. And again, I think there were a number of critical messages that you have relayed: the importance of investing more in analytics, and again, the good work being done by various partners, including, of course, FAO. Again, it's really also encouraging to know and learn that in terms of the analysis, the risk analysis, you're not just looking, of course, at the short term, but 3, 10, a decade, and a couple of decades down the road, given the importance of, again, the cumulative nature of the climate impact on communities and vulnerable communities on the ground, and the aspect around financing, and of course, local to national, and ensuring that it goes to scale. Message is very, very clear, and I take this opportunity again to thank all of our panelists and encourage our participants to feel free to come in with any comments, any questions, any good practices that you can also share with the colleagues online. This is the opportunity to do so. And while perhaps doing so, maybe I can circle back again to Caroline, if that would be okay, Caroline, perhaps just to give us a sense, some more visual regarding the climate charter and how it links to the work that is envisaged and is planned for the climate roadmap. Any linkages there that would help us, relay the message again to the colleagues online that the key point here is around complementarity of efforts. So of course, the roadmap is one critical component, but again, Rain, as you've mentioned as well, there's a lot of work already that is ongoing, and it's good to know that in addition to, of course, looking at mitigating the impact of the climate crisis, we're also looking at our own actions as organizations in terms of carbon footprint and how we can reduce the carbon footprint and work towards eliminating it down the road. But if you can just give us also a sense, Caroline, as I know IFRC was quite critical in spearheading the climate charter, how it links to the work of the roadmap as well. Over to you, please, Caroline.
Well, thanks again, Mervat, and thank you. I'm listening intently to obviously the fellow panelists, and I think there's a lot of collaborative thought and spirit here in terms of how we move this forward, which probably isn't a surprise to any of us. So how do we get to that next stage? And for me, that's where the charter is critical. It is about commitment, and it is about measuring commitment and signing up to say, yes, we stand by this, and we will support and advocate and deliver. I mean, the charter at this point has been signed by over 400 organisations. 130 of those are national societies, and I don't say that to wave the IFRC flag. I say that because localisation is critical in this, and there's evidence that localisation and local actors are also committed to this, and they deserve our full support in terms of getting behind it. But that number also suggests that broad engagement and commitment. It's change. It's behaviour change. If it was purely a matter of process, it would have been done already. It would have been, the process is easy. It's the behaviour change and it's the mindset change. And it will be painful to start with. But the fact that we are all collectively committing because we all believe in what we've been saying on the panel this afternoon, I think is a really important part. So the roadmap essentially will seek to complement and reinforce the charter and vice versa. And it's, Rain took us through in some detail those 6 elements that really speak directly to those commitments that have been made. I won't run through the detail of the charter here, because I would encourage actually everybody that's online to go and have a look at the website itself. I think that's way more interesting and engaging, and spend some time having a look. www.climatecharter.org. Go and look for yourself and see where those complementarities are and how that matches with what you've heard us speak of this afternoon, but also how organizations that really are committed to this, where are some of the areas that they can really start to make a difference. So great that these are established. I think for too long now, our initiatives, certainly in the humanitarian sector, success has really been driven by a perception of speed, of quality, and of cost. And that mindset change and the difference that we now need to start making is looking at that longer term. George spoke eloquently around it. It's from 6 months to 30 years, and these trajectories are clear. We need to make sure that we're building that into our thinking, and also that we're fully costing what we do. It's not just about who can do it the cheapest or who can do it the fastest. It's also that, by the way, because budgets are dwindling and we need to make sure that we're delivering in the most cost-effective and relevant and appropriate way. But actually, are we fully costing what we do? And it's time to really start thinking about that. Mervat, you just mentioned carbon footprint and looking at the longer term and the broader implications of what we do and how we act. So I'd really encourage that we also start to talk in those terms as well. I think too often we go into default mode when there's a crisis, when there's a disaster, and I'd really welcome us moving that dial a little bit and starting to talk about the full costing model of what it looks like to intervene. So I think those conversations need to also happen at all levels. That's not just for any one headquarters to think about, but it's also for all of those levels and driven by local organizations and communities, of course, telling us what they need and what they want, and us taking that responsibility to make sure that we're delivering that in the most appropriate and dignified and sustainable way for people and for planet. Back to you, Mervat. Thanks.
Many thanks, Caroline, and I think your words echo quite importantly, especially as we approach COP29 also later on this year, and I'm hoping this platform and this launch is also an opportunity to encourage more colleagues within the IASC and beyond to sign up to the climate charter, because it's a critical charter, and many organizations, as you've pointed out, have already signed up to it, and the more, of course, we translate these commitments to action, the more we'll see the results on the ground. Perhaps with that, turning to Rain, there are a couple of maybe, and sorry if I'm putting you also on the spot, because I do see a comment that has come in around the climate financing aspect, and especially around the loss and damage fund, because of course this came up very strongly in COP28, and I'm sure there are significant conversations ongoing at the moment to try to shape our dialogue, and in terms of how we influence discussions around climate financing, especially the loss and damage fund. So any insights, again, Rain or Caroline or also George, that you might have on this would be particularly helpful for the audience. And while Rain, I give you the floor, it would also be great to bring forward some examples of how FAO has been able, what specific activities you've been able to take forward on the ground operationally to address the climate issues in the various contexts. So over to you, please, Rain.
Yeah, thank you, Mervat. And maybe if I could just, I mean, you were mentioning COP, and I wanted to say, I think there are some really encouraging discussions that are taking place at the moment. In fact, just this week here in Rome, we've had 2 days of really important discussions that were co-hosted by WFP and FAO, the Rome-based agencies, together with IFAD, but importantly with the COP28 and COP29 presidencies. And the whole focus was around this question of accessing, partnering up to scale climate actions, but specifically in fragile and conflict-affected situations. And what I thought was so interesting and encouraging there is, I mean, we had strong participation from a series of countries at the front line, and it was both ministers of environment, but it was also individuals that connect into leadership that's coordinating across ministry. So we had senior people within a senior person within the Prime Minister's office in Somalia, for example, to take one. But this question around, having had attention for the first time in COP28 on relief and recovery and peace issues and themes that touch on this, the fact that it's clear that the COP29 presidency are keen to sustain it, I think is very encouraging. Incumbent on us then in the IASC to see how we can support these discussions. So that's a little bit different to the question you were asking, but I thought worth mentioning. I think we need to continue to find all of these spaces to draw together discussions in the right way. But maybe, I mean, just quickly on some examples, and I'm sure, we'll have all sorts of exciting examples from participants on the call today. In FAO's case, because we're in the first instance a development organization that also works in the emergency and humanitarian spaces, we're doing everything we can to support members to end hunger, amongst other things. Unsurprisingly, then our climate-related work is both short-term actions, but importantly, the longer-term activities that are focused on building resilience. And when we talk about building resilience, it's, yes, it's actions at the household level, but it's also about these key questions around social cohesion, around local peace, around issues that have to do with management of resources that are increasingly under pressure. I mean, let me just maybe mention work that we do with in East Africa with pastoralist field schools. One of the things that we do through those field schools is specifically attention to inclusive, improved management of pasture in challenged environments, in arid and semi-arid areas across the Horn of Africa. And that's both about pasture availability, but also about accessibility. It's about recognizing how more and more frequent droughts are impacting the rangeland, and how we address questions of supporting livestock and pastoralist livelihoods in terms of their adaptation moving forward. And it gets into questions around the right way to manage local level conflict and tensions over these precious resources, whether it's the pasture land or whether it's water or different pieces. And again, I could go through, context by context, a series of examples, but it's, we work a lot in this space anyway as an organization. There's something about the intentionality and looking at how we address then the impacts of these shocks in a way that's significant for us. Maybe a couple of words on the loss and damage discussion, and there just to say, colleagues, that we have last year issued for the first time a flagship report on damage in the agricultural sector as FAO, and that has quantified loss and damage in the damages in the first instance in the agricultural sector over the last 30 years, and quantified that as being well in excess of $3 trillion, and significant percentages of agricultural GDP that's being impacted. So the imperative to work on these issues is, I think, indispensable. Obviously, the work around loss and damage and the financing that comes from it is, financing that should and needs to go to governments in the first instance, rather than financing that comes to humanitarian actors specifically. But we have a key role to play as a humanitarian community in this regard, as specialist entities, and it's really around supporting the use and the application of that financing to ensure that it reaches the most affected communities, and that we're looking to build coherence with the work we're doing in terms of our response activities as well. So, I mean, there's a much longer conversation around this, as everyone knows, but I think it's really important that we understand what the appropriate role for the IASC and its entities is in the bigger conversation around loss and damage. Mervat, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Many thanks, Rain, and thanks for tackling quite a number of issues in your response. And I know for certain there are indeed quite a lot of discussions, and it's great to see, particularly compared to previous years, the IASC organizations, UN, INGOs, IFRC, and others coming together to make sure that in terms of negotiations, in terms of influencing the discussions of the COP29, in terms of influencing discussions around the loss and damage, we're doing it in a much more coherent and coordinated approach, perhaps, than previously, and that's quite important to make sure that the key issues that you've highlighted, of course, as panelists in today's discussion, are well taken into account as we embark on the next steps with the outcomes around the loss and damage discussions. So perhaps with that, George, turning to you, there is a question around what more can be done or what can be done better amongst the various agencies and organizations to tackle the impact of the climate crisis, and particularly with its interplay with other drivers. So I think this is more of an internal looking exercise. So of course there's critical work being done with local authorities, with communities, but I think around the coordination aspect with agencies and organizations, what more can be done to ensure that we work more, in a more efficient manner, in a more coordinated manner, to look at how we address the impact of the climate crisis, particularly in light of its interplay with other drivers. So perhaps, George, over to you on this particular point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mervat. And it's a really good question, of course, because Somalia is subject to multiple types of shocks, not just those related to the climate crisis, but they intersect very deeply with the broader peace and security context of the country, with the economic challenges that the country has been experiencing, and of course, acknowledging where Somalia is on its peace state building path over the past decade plus. And so there's a lot of work to do across multiple fronts. And of course, this creates challenges vis-a-vis prioritization and focus, especially when so much of the collective attention of the international community is on really on a short-term perspective, dealing with the crises of the day, whether they're political, security, or humanitarian, and finding difficulty to take that longer-term view of the risks on the horizon that are going to be really challenging over the course of the next decades and only get worse and deeper. I am appreciative that the government is now starting in Somalia to take that long-term perspective, is finalizing a Centennial Vision 2060, looking at the Somalia of the future and trying to come to grips with what are in fact existential threats and crises facing the country, and trying to look at what the country can come out on the other side. But taking an integrated view across these is really, really important. So I think both taking a better medium to longer term view of the risks and threats to the country, looking at how they intersect with each other, and finding opportunities for cross-sectoral integrated types of solutions are going to be fundamental for our collective path forward, including how it is that we're trying to attract financing. I'll give an example of a project that we launched just a few weeks ago in Somalia, which is ostensibly a flood mitigation program. It's called the Jowar Off-Stream Storage Program, and is designed, again, led by FAO, designed to rehabilitate infrastructure, water management infrastructure off the Shabelle River, but builds around it. And so it has impacts both in terms of flood management, but also in terms of better water management to alleviate dry seasons and make sure that water, when it does come, is better harvested and used. But it builds around it good community-based work around social cohesion, around durable solutions, around local governance, around peace building and conflict management, and looking at these in a more integrated fashion, because these issues can't be addressed in silos and independently. And unfortunately, as we all know, the way our systems work, we tend to address challenges in very siloed or clusterized ways that mitigate against the types of integrated solutions that we need. We are making a push in Somalia to shift the way we do business towards localized area-based approaches and forcing new types of collaboration in ways that the system isn't used to. And this includes around funding, because the way that funding happens is too often clusterized, is too often guided by donor priorities that don't necessarily accord with the realities on the ground. And so both the quantity of financing and the quality of financing are very problematic in this respect, because it's not balanced sufficiently in ways that enable better integrated responses, the types of integrated responses that are necessary to deal with complex integrated problems. So again, a very good question. Just to touch on the issue of financing just for 30 seconds. I mean, you know, again, in Somalia, a country that is in the top tier of countries impacted by the climate crisis and that contributed almost nothing to this crisis, the question of loss and damages is very important. We did do a quantification, for example, of the damages resulting from the floods of last year. Again, the worst floods in a century, and they're quite significant, of course, with massive infrastructure damage, but incredible losses in terms of agricultural productivity, livelihoods, displacement, and everything else. But we can't just, you know, we have to deal with the impacts, but at the same time, we really need to shift the financing towards the future, towards prevention, towards mitigation, towards adaptation, towards the things that are going to actually change the trajectories and reduce the risks and vulnerabilities for the future. Thanks.
Hugely appreciated, George. I can see quite a few questions coming in, so I will not attempt to summarize the main highlights from your responses, but perhaps turning to Caroline, as there is a question and there's a desire to discuss a bit more and talk a little bit more about the climate change related displacement issue. And one of the questions that has come in from a colleague, I can hear some background noise. If I can just ask all colleagues to just put their phones and their computers on mute, that would be great. Thank you. Whether is relocation of affected populations a viable solution in cases where loss of land and livelihoods are irreversible? So perhaps, you know, Caroline, perhaps you can give this a shot in terms of response, and I'll just buy you a little bit of time to think about the response by turning to Rain with another question related to the financing issue. And again, it's an equally interesting and also intriguing question. And it is around what safeguards and guiding principles are being considered to ensure that the humanitarian sector does not move in on limited climate finance. So that's also, you know, quite an important question to respond to. And I know it's not a straightforward response, but I am, again, just buying Rain also some time to give some consideration to this question. And then finally, I'll turn to George with the third question, and it's around the various country-level planning processes, whether it's the HRP, UNSDCF, NAPs, amongst others, and how are we ensuring a certain level of coherence or coordination in the various planning and response processes and strategies to ensure that we bring in the climate aspects, to ensure that we bring in the resilience aspect, to ensure that we bring in the solutions aspect in these various planning processes and initiatives. So with that, perhaps Caroline, turning to you first on the displacement question, over to you.
Thank you, and a really important and difficult question. You know, all of these questions are difficult. As I said before, if any of this was easy, we'd probably be further down the path than we are. I mean, I think, thank you for the question, by the way. I'm certainly not shying away from it. We need to react to the current needs, don't we? I mean, clearly there are some places where relocation is the only option. Is it a viable solution? Probably not, but it's the only option for some communities caught in this. We need to also make sure that we adapt as much as we possibly can, but obviously from a humanitarian perspective, the protection of lives and livelihoods is absolutely critical. But it's about this transformational approach and this transformational thinking, community-led, community-driven approaches, which really does require still a revolution. We talk about it, but it's not coming to the fore as much as it should. So we still need to be willing to transform. If we project into the future, we know that 2.5 degrees of warming will make many places uninhabitable. So inevitably, we need to think collectively about what this means for those communities. We need communities to also be part of that solution, and none of us can afford to take these short-term views. That short-termism and sort of forgetting that there is a lot of work, and resilience of communities is already there in many ways. Communities are living and breathing this on a daily basis, but rather than think that we come in and build and strengthen, it's about augmenting and supporting communities who are living in these environments and making sure that we're thinking long-term enough. And that again is why the roadmap and the charter commitments and all of these very practical measures are absolutely critical. We'll also have to take choices, or we'll have to make choices, and I think tough questions about what we do and what we're able to support with the resources available to us. But it's clear that into a future that looks rather bleak, help will come from within. And how can we best support and place, and as I say, augment? I keep using that word because it's an important word. How do we really lift what's already there and support communities to come up with the solutions of some of these critical issues? Back to you, Mervat. Thanks.
Thank you, Caroline. Thanks for giving this question a strong stab and response, and perhaps with that turning to Rain. And Rain, on the financing question, I'll make it even more interesting and perhaps challenging by adding an additional component to the question, because more questions are coming in specifically on the financing bit. And so one proposal is thoughts around whether the loss and damage fund should include the humanitarian window. So any views on that would be appreciated. And also a comment that came from participants with regards to how only 0.2% of humanitarian funding is being allocated to anticipatory action, which is, of course, as suggested by the participant, is an issue of concern. So curious to know your reaction, perhaps, Rain, to these points. Over to you, please.
Thank you. I'd also love to hear colleagues' reactions that are posing the questions on these questions, because I think we're already all grappling with them. But maybe a few quick points. One, just on the anticipatory act. So even before I get to anticipatory action, just to say, I think we need to approach all of these financing questions with some shared principles and ideas in mind. And obviously, when it comes to climate financing and the financing that we want to go on these issues, we need to be holding everyone accountable to make sure that whatever monies are made available are new and additional, right? That this is not about repurposing or relabeling any financing. This is new, meaningful money that comes onto these issues, however they're set up and however they're packaged. There's a reason why this continues to be part of the constant advocacy. But then I think before we get into any of the climate financing discussions, we have, and I think the anticipatory action question is a really good example of this. We have all sorts of unfinished business on the humanitarian side in terms of improvements and changes that need to be put in place for the type and the nature of our financing to be fit for the current reality and fit for the future reality that's dominated by now and in the future dominated by the crisis. And the fact that, this percentage on anticipatory action is just stunning, despite all of the evidence around its relevance. The business case has already been put forward and endorsed years and years ago in terms of why anticipatory action makes sense. So working with specific donors to understand what it is that needs to change in their legislative frameworks or in their decision-making processes to free up more money into that space, I think is absolutely key. I'm not going to get into the question around whether the loss and damage funding should have a humanitarian window. I mean, just to say, we need to really resist the urge to try and have climate financing be the answer to whatever humanitarian funding gaps exist. That we need to deal with humanitarian funding gaps by having more effective humanitarian response and a number of other things. But I really think we need to resist the push to see that as a solution to a pre-existing challenge and a problem that we have. And the loss and damage financing, as I mentioned before, I think needs to be focused towards authorities and used by authorities, and we can add a value, we can have a value additive role, an important role, as I said, in terms of connecting that in the right way to ensure it's going to affected communities, and the role that we can play on the coherence side, right? On the, what we're looking for are everything feeding into the right types of outcomes. And I think this links back also to the planning framework question you had for George, which I think is key. Thankfully, Medvat, I think we're coming close to being out of time, because those are not easy questions to answer, but hopefully there are a few helpful elements there. Over to you.
That was super helpful, Rain. Thanks a million for that. And turning to George, please, on the coherence of the various planning processes and initiatives on the ground. Over to you, please, George.
Thanks. And again, a very good question, in particular in terms of how do we focus ourselves cross-pillar and across multiple mandates on common challenges and collective outcomes, which, given the nature of our system and the way that we're structured, is unfortunately more difficult than it should be. But we do have in Somalia a very deliberate synergy between annual humanitarian needs and response plans, its alignment with the objectives of the government's own national development plans and the UN Development Systems Cooperation Framework. And we do operate around collective outcomes as we're mandated to do. But importantly also, we've really tried to coalesce around top tier collective priorities. And in Somalia, as a system, cross-pillar, we have agreed on 3 cross-pillar humanitarian development, human rights, political, and in fact security priorities as they relate to climate adaptation and water, number 1. Number 2, durable solutions, given the extent of protracted internal displacement in the country, impacting with 20% of the population in a state of perpetual internal displacement. And 3, accountability, anti-corruption, and aid diversion, which became particularly topical in the course of the humanitarian scale-up in the course of 2022, 2023. And it's by agreeing on these types of top-tier priorities that we can harness the focus, the energy, and the respective technical competencies of actors across the system towards these collective outcomes. And these are deep-rooted systemic challenges that is tough to get joined-up action on, particularly with the way that the systems are structured, and especially given the way that financing flows, because the fragmentation of financing and the competing demands, especially in an environment like Somalia, where there's multiple multi-billion-dollar demands across the security side, across the political side, certainly in terms of the development and adaptation spaces, and in terms of the recurrent humanitarian needs. It makes it very and the degree of endemic, competition within the system here, is problematic. But the needs vastly across all pillars of our work exceed what's available. So we have to make the smartest investment choices necessary. And I go back to Rain's comment around, we know what the business logic is here. We know the benefit of investing in anticipation or in prevention as against the cost of response. I mean, it's variably based on different analyses, anything from 1/3 of the cost to anticipate a response to 1/18 of the cost, depending on the nature of the crisis. But that's not the way funding structures actually work. So again, it's difficult to get integrated, flexible financing that enables integrated, joined up work on solutions. but it's absolutely essential because these types of wicked problems that these countries are facing need joined up integrated solutions. Over.
Much appreciated, George. And I think this is a perennial issue that we've been grappling with as a system. And I know governments have been also confronting head on, as well as, communities, because as you've mentioned, the business case is there, the evidence is there, yet we're challenged to mobilize the right type of funding, as Rain also mentioned, quality, multi-year, flexible funding to enable, the response to be appropriate to the nature of the crisis that we're facing, which is not just the immediate, of course, impact, but also the medium and long-term impacts of the climate crisis and other types of crisis as well. I'm conscious that we have a few more minutes before we wrap up this launch event, and I would like us to spend a minute or two max per panelist, perhaps to share final reflections, final comments, final words of wisdom and advice before we conclude today's discussion. So perhaps, again, Caroline, maybe you can kick us off, turning and then to Rain and then to George, and then we'll conclude the launch event. Over to you, please, Caroline.
Thank you. How to sum it up? I mean, I think, in terms of what we've heard, we have to keep the hope. We have to see that we're having conversations like this, that we're launching initiatives that are really lifting these priorities of the political agenda. And I think that's a really important part to remember, that lifting the prioritization and the ability to advocate on these matters is key. But local action, it's that transformation, dare I say the word revolution, but it's that transformation of thinking and really making sure that we are delivering at local level, that we are trusting communities and affected people to tell us what their needs are, and rather just give them what we have, actually listen and support them to deliver their own resilience and adaptation during these difficult times. But that advocacy has to come collectively from all of our voices. That ambitious and smart partnerships really will be important on this. But if you ask me one thing, then it's action, and it's locally led action that will really help us to collectively solve some of these issues for our planet. Back to you.
Thanks, Caroline. Locally led action, the key word coming out of your final remarks. Over to you, Rain.
Madhavat, thank you. I mean, maybe I'd say, and this sort of pulls in then what we've said about both programming interventions, advocacy work, the planning frameworks that George was speaking to, the financing questions. I think what we need to consciously do in our organizations and collectively is really take on leadership roles to drive forward the right type of integrated approaches in support of the lived realities of these highly vulnerable communities that we're working in, and finding the right way, the right and the appropriate way to connect what's happening in terms of climate related efforts to address that. This is certainly something that we're fully committed to as well, and so understanding specific context, looking at what makes sense in those settings, I think is imperative. And again, as I said before, let's the unfinished business that we have, which we know we have around how to improve humanitarian action, we need to address that, but we need to make sure that we're not trying to address that in the wrong way, or using tools that are being put in place to address other issues. But it's up to us to find the right connection between these pieces. But I've really appreciated the opportunity to speak about the roadmap and contribute to the panel discussions today with Caroline and with George. Thank you.
Many thanks, Rain. Coherence, coordination, and partnership come out strongly. Over to you, George.
Likewise, grateful for the opportunity for this discussion and to benefit from the insights and knowledge of Rain and Caroline, and the really good questions from the floor. So thank you for that. I think, one, we need to really up our game on joint collective analysis and looking at the scenarios that we're facing for the future, because we do collectively suffer from chronic short-termism, and reality is going to catch up with us. It's already catching up with us quicker than we thought, and that only gets worse from here. And so we have to start investing in different ways and making the business case for a different type of engagement. Second, as I said in my earlier comments, we have to break down the silos that we operate through, including between humanitarians and development and peace actors. And we've had this, the dialogue around the so-called nexus or complementarity of humanitarian development and peace work. But we're all driven by institutional incentives that work against that grain. And we need a massive shift in culture amongst all of us, including within the IASC. How it is that we can start to behave differently and deal with these existential crises for what they are is going to be a massively important, and figure out ways to disincentivize the types of competition that we currently see within the system. And lastly, just on financing, I mean, the financing landscape, we have learned so much in the past 5 years, in the past 20 years, in the past, frankly, 50 years about what works in terms of financing, but the financing is going in exactly the wrong direction. It's getting worse, right? We're not seeing better quality of financing. The quantity of financing is going to all the wrong priorities at a global level. These are political decisions of member states. This is how the international financing sectors work. And I do think the Secretary General is right to raise fundamental questions around this in the context of the Summit of the Future to take place in September in New York. So I think, this is something we all need to advocate collectively around, because it is not in favor of the types of solutions that we need to be implementing in even a minimalist scenario. I'll leave my comments there, but thank you for this opportunity.
Brilliant, George. Really good way to conclude today's discussion and the launch. Joint collective analysis addressing the chronic short-termism of our sector, breaking down silos and the cultural shift that's needed, and addressing the financing issue, which is a much bigger issue, and especially as there is a political angle and factor to this. Really, really huge thanks, George, Caroline, and Rain. Thank you so much for making the time, and big thanks to all of your organizations, as well as all of the IASC members and beyond that have made this roadmap possible. Now, where the rubber hits the road is really translating this roadmap to action, and we're counting on all of the IASC member organizations and partners to work hand in hand with our leadership on the ground, George and other humanitarian coordinators and country reps, as well as, of course, with national authorities to make sure that these plans come to fruition. Hugely, hugely appreciated, and many thanks to all of those who joined us today with the very good questions, the very intriguing questions. Far from easy questions to respond to, but we look forward to continuing the debate and the dialogue to make sure that we translate this to a reality. Many, many thanks again, colleagues, for the time. All the very best. Thank you.
Thanks, Mervat. Thanks, everyone.